Hey there, and welcome to episode 5 of Irony is the Truest Medicine. This is a long walk video to that punchline. I haven't gotten anywhere near it yet. The closest I've come is to be talking about truest. I've been trying for the last 30 years to figure out what the actual fuck I am. Lots of people claim they are trying to figure out what they really are, or that they're searching for meaning or the truth. So you should be skeptical when I say that's my mission here. In fact, it's a very romantic sounding mission. And romance is the opposite of truth in this respect. And it is a little ironic, which is, to me, romance is the dream of happily ever after that lives in all of us but cannot be met by reality. That is an untrue dream. But boy, do we yearn for it, we human beings. Yearn for it largely because we have language that enables us to imagine infinites in a way that no other organism could. Infinite good, infinite freedom, infinite truth, that sort of thing. So we humans tend to work in binaries and superlatives like true or false. And this is a product of having symbolic competence, this rare, unprecedented ability that humans have to work in symbols, in language, which makes us tend towards the idea of completeness, that we could have it all once and for all. If I say I want to figure out what the actual fuck I am, you're right to be skeptical, because lots of people say that, and it's part of their romantic story. It's like a movie in which someone is seeking the truth, like some Dan Brown novel. He did write one about this called Origins, which is a romanticized tale of a man seeking the ultimate truth, an Elon Musk-like man seeking the ultimate truth. Talk about the tensions between realism and romanticism. Elon Musk captures that nicely. But by the end of the novel by Dan Brown called Origins, they've concluded that the universe's heat death is like 1,000 points of light, and we all live happily ever after when there's no more free energy. Anyway, so you should be skeptical of me as I say that, but what I'm trying to do is get a truer version of what I am. And I think that you will find after this long walk that irony is the truest medicine, and that it is medicinal, and that it's not exactly irony. It's actually dirony, dire irony. I could have called this thing Dirony is the truest medicine, but no one would understand that. So what I mean by irony is not just humor or an ironic laughing it off. That's half of it. The other is that life is terrifying, and we really care. You're not just laughing it off. It's dire irony. And the easiest way to see this is that slipping on a banana peel is ironic. If we define irony as outcomes that are the reverse of what's expected, slipping on a banana peel is ironic. You expected ground to offer you friction. Instead, it offered you slipperiness, the reverse of stickiness, and you fell. As long as you survived it, that's life. There will be these ironic situations. There have been from the beginning. I think that's the hardest news for us to take from Darwin, that there is no perfect recipe for living. You just get a good one and suddenly, ironically, it stops working or is counterproductive. That's what Darwin recognized about the struggle for existence. You can do what you can to eliminate ironic situations, but you can't actually eliminate them completely, no matter how hard you try. Let me go back to my long walk. One of the ironic challenges I'm dealing with here is like eating my own mouth. I am trying to come up with a better interpretation. I'm trying to understand myself, which is like eating my mouth. I am using my capacity to learn to try to understand my capacity to learn. I am using my words to figure out what I was before words. In this process, I could escape into words, even words that sound like I'm escaping words. I could use spiritual, lofty, or poetic, or mystical words that make it sound like I'm transcending words, transcending all of the human nonsense to get at what I am. This is something you'd get from spiritual people. They would come up with words like mindfulness that make it feel like you're not working in words, or no mind from Buddhism, or we being non-being from Taoism. These sound like they're an attempt to escape words, but they're still words. I'm trying to avoid abstractions that would distract from my ability to figure out what I am. The other thing I'm doing here is trying to do it etiologically. I could describe myself. I could even come up with a box and arrow diagram of how I work. Both of those are based on the assumption that I work. And I'm trying to do something that goes deeper than that. I'm seeking a physically grounded explanation for what I am. And I don't mean one that is empirically testable against reality, like, I find out that I have genes and all of that. No, I have to actually figure out what I am, starting without living beings at all, in a strictly physical, chemical, classical physics world. That could be another source of skepticism. We now know classical physics and chemistry aren't the whole picture. There's a whole quantum level to things. If I can't explain myself from the classic physics we live in, then maybe I'd have to resort to explaining myself from quantum mechanics. But in the meantime, what we do is physical, and it's actually pretty straightforward, simple physics. Nothing we wholly depend on doing for our survival relies on quantum phenomena. It's a little dubious to go there because we don't quite understand or have an explanation for what's going on at the level of quantum phenomena. So there's long been a tendency for people to try to find consciousness in quantum phenomena. Quantum mechanics is a mystery, consciousness is a mystery, therefore quantum mechanics is consciousness, and consciousness is quantum mechanics. That's a Mysterian move. It's a move towards the mysterious, like looking for the key to what we are, where it's darkest, where we have the most room to be impressionistic and vague. I'm not going that route any more than I'm going the spiritual route. I'm trying to figure out what I am. You assume a physical world of the simplest kind. You've got molecules, and you've got patterns or form. And you also have this tendency for form to become formless over time. We call it the second law of thermodynamics, the first law of everything. And it's not actually a law, it's a simple statistical property, which is if you've got stuff that is sorted out or segregated, and then you add motion, then it'll get desegregated over time. Why? Because there are more desegregated or unsorted states than there are sorted states. So for example, to make it as intuitive as possible, I've got this nicely aligned box of toothpicks. The toothpicks in it are nicely aligned. And I toss it into the ocean. At first, those toothpicks are aligned for a second, but they float around independently and become more and more misaligned. You could say that their alignment becomes less and less likely over time. And that's all I'm talking about. It's not even a law of thermodynamics, it's a law of everything. Thermodynamics implies that it only applies to energy. No, that's not the case. It applies to anything. I'm not losing energy by misaligning them in the ocean. There's no loss of usable energy when I do that. But nonetheless, you get this strong tendency towards disorder. So what am I starting with when I say I want a physically grounded ideological explanation? Ideological means explaining from the origins, with no smoke and mirrors. I don't get to use any abstract terms from quantum mechanics, spirituality, or any kind of descriptive impressionistic things. I have to explain how the universe ended up with me, starting with nothing but matter and form and this tendency for form to become formless. Let me now unpack what I mean about matter and form, and this is not fancy stuff. It'll be totally intuitive to you. Form and matter go hand in hand. There is no matter without form, and there is no form without matter. This is totally intuitive. Plato notices that there's controversy and disagreement about what's good in the world. And he starts to try to figure, okay, well, how would you know who to believe about what's good in the world? This is Plato speaking on behalf of Socrates for all we know. That is, it's hard to tell what Socrates believed or what Plato believed because there's no written record of Socrates other than Plato. But anyway, Plato is saying, well, okay, we disagree about what's good, so we have to figure out who's credible on that. And let's assume there's a standard. You could say an ideal standard for credibility, that there would be someone who could see things purely. He's a little ambiguous about whether there's someone like a god who sees things purely, or whether it's ideas in their purest form with no god who sees them. But he's basically trying to align himself with pure form. So Plato is called an idealist, and idealism is about both terms. It's idea in the abstract, the physically grounded idea, and it's also ideal. Remember, I said that with language, and Plato's one of the first to be trying to explore what we are in language, in writing. He's imagining infinite good, infinite cred. That's what he's trying to do. And he comes to the conclusion that there are these ideal ideas out in the universe or in another realm, and that we are reflections, impoverished reflections of the ideal. In a way, he's working off of Pythagoras. Pythagoras imagines the ideal triangle and comes to some recognitions about what's true about that triangle. And Plato's trying to do that about friendship and virtue. He wants to figure out what the ideal standard is for virtue, about love. That's what his symposium is about. Guys sitting around drinking wine and talking about the true nature of love. So coming back to this thing about form and matter, Plato really treats them as separate. Form is immaterial something from another realm that then gets impressed or imposed into matter. And I'm sure you can see the parallel. He's doing basically the same thing that the Christians or the religious people do when they talk about God's Spirit, this incarnate source of supernatural stuff that gets breathed into matter and makes it come alive. So that's Plato's approach to it. And Aristotle, who studied with Plato for 21 years and then felt perfectly entitled to disagree with him, said that's not actually how form and matter work. I'm with Aristotle on this. Aristotle said you can't have matter without form and you can't have form without matter. I'm trying to keep in mind my goal here, which is to figure out what I am. And I am a kind of form in matter. I have to get clear on what kind of form in matter I am. But I don't assume, for example, that I have some supernatural soul that got breathed, metaphorically, into my body and then will somehow leak out at death, leaving only matter. I think that there is only matter and form as a piece. And so I have to get clear on what I mean by form. Let's just take a simple example of a form. Let's just take a donut. And let's assume that the donut is already as stale and solid as it's going to be. It's got a form. But what is its form? Well, first of all, it's comprised of matter. I'll ask you to buy that it's made of dough. What is its form? The likely and unlikely presence and absence of matter in space. When I talk about its form, I'm saying you can move the thing around in space, but wherever you move it, there's a relationship between the matter that makes the ring and the absence of matter that makes the hole and the outside of the ring. It's as simple as that. That's what form is. The way scientists would talk about this is it's a constraint. By constraint, I mean there are limitations on where you would expect to find matter and not matter in the shape of a donut. You could have all sorts of donuts, mutated donuts, mutant donuts that are shaped all sorts of different ways. Set aside the question about whether something qualifies for being a donut if it's got this mutant feature or that one. I'm just talking about, when we think about form, we're talking about presence and absence of matter, the unlikely and likely places that will find matter. So when I say all matter has form, it can change over time. That's crucial to this story. But I also have to understand that at any moment in time, there are likely and unlikely places to find matter. Just apply this to your own form. Your form changes. My form changes. When I've had a salty meal, I tend to puff up. When I've shown a little self-discipline, I tend to shrink because I don't eat as much. As I age, my form morphs. The constraints loosen up to where I'm starting to gain deformities. I tend to degenerate. My form finally succumbing to the second law of thermodynamics. It's finally succumbing in that I am getting kind of mixed up in my body, my physical form. But for my life, I'm actually maintaining my form, and this will be a crucial difference between me and inanimate things. In the meantime, just take this in. There's likely and unlikely places to find matter. We can specify which kinds of matter to apply this form thing to something fluid. If you have a cup of coffee and you pour milk into it, at first there's a segregation. There are unlikely and likely places to find milk molecules and coffee molecules at first in your cup of coffee, because the milk hasn't yet diffused or dispersed into the coffee. So that's what I mean by segregation, and it's also what I mean by a form. There's unlikely and likely places to find coffee versus milk molecules because they're segregated at first. There's an order to it. There's a form. There's milk on one side and coffee on the other. But given Brownian motion and whatever jiggling is going on, I could also say that there's another property of this matter that is also segregated, which is if the coffee was hot, the molecules in it are moving around very fast, bumping into each other. And if the milk was cold, they're moving more slowly. So you've got different kinds of matter and different energy. By energy, I mean the speed at which the molecules are moving around. At first, you've got that segregation, and then what happens? Well, molecules are bouncing around against each other, shuffling, like throwing toothpicks into the water. Eventually, they get all mixed up to where the likelinesses have disappeared. A milk molecule could be anywhere. A coffee molecule could be anywhere within the cup. So what I'm saying is that form tends to deform over time. The segregation tends to get mixed up over time. And I mean that about both the energy and the matter. You could say that the milk-coffee mixture, once it's all mixed up, becomes homogeneous in temperature and color. It becomes a latte, right? But actually that's not how it works. The molecules are now moving more randomly. They're all mixed up. It's actually more desegregated and more complicated to describe. One way this shows up is the question, which is more complicated, a frog or a frog smoothie? Actually, the frog smoothie is more complex because the molecules are all mixed up. In a frog's body, we're maintaining the order. We're maintaining the constraints on our form. Not perfectly. As I get older, I get arthritis and a lump might show up on my shoulder. I'm not a static thing like a donut, but I am nonetheless doing the work while I'm alive to maintain the form I am. Unlike a donut or even a cup of coffee, I'm doing it with different matter flowing through me. So this is a fascinating thing. I'm not made of matter, energy. my form is maintained as matter and energy pass through me. So the question is, what am I? Starting from the ground up, without any transcendental moves, without getting confused by the fact that I'm human, but actually trying to understand what I actually am, which is a self-making, functional, interpretive effort. A self trying to stay alive, a self doing work that works to keep me working in my workspace. To explain what that is, I'm starting at the bottom and I'm describing what I'm going to have to explain, which is I am a form. Like all forms, I'm comprised of matter. There's no form without matter. Plato was wrong about this. It's a pretty image, but it's not real. There is no form without matter. So I am a form that is a product of matter flowing through me, like the breakfast I just had, or that latte which I just drank. And yet I am somehow maintaining my own form. I am constraining the constraints I am down to a constraint that I maintain as long as I'm alive. And then what happens to me when I die? All the matter that was in me from my last breakfast, I know what I would order for my last supper, but you kind of have to be from the 1960s to appreciate this joke. I would have Jell-O because in the 60s the ad was there's always room for Jell-O. So if I was imprisoned and they asked me what I want for my last supper, it would be Jell-O because that way I would never have to die. But back to reality here. When I die, the matter that was in me is deconstrained. It's free to take on any form. What I actually have to explain, if I want to know what I am, is how I self-constrain, how I prevent myself from falling apart as long as I'm alive. This week, that's been the theme. I even wrote it up as a poem. I touched on this framing in the last episode, but I've come up with a short poem to get at it. You're just made of meat. You're out in the heat. Why haven't you quickly decayed? You made it to geezer, not preserved in a freezer. Just how'd your decay get delayed? How is it that while we're alive, made of this stuff, how long would you leave a piece of meat out at room temperature safely? How long would you allow that to go on? Not long, right? If you had some burger meat and you left it out on the kitchen table, you'd get a little worried about it if it was out for more than 6 hours. Look at you. You can live to 80 or 90 and you're made of meat. So why aren't you green and putrid? Is a really good way to get at this question of what the actual fuck are we? Because nothing but meat. But we're meat in a certain form, and we delay our decay. The question I'm dealing with is how we maintain the constraint that we are. How we do that is the interesting question, not what we're made of. So it's not like I'm made of some supernatural material. I'm nothing but molecules in motion. How I constrain that motion so that I remain in place, that's the question I have to get at if I really want to understand what I am. How I do that work to maintain myself. Everything I'm describing comes from me jamming for 30 years with Terrence Deacon. He was a Harvard neuroscientist, biological anthropologist when I first met him. Then he moved to Berkeley, where he was a full professor and taught the main neuroscience courses. While doing all of that, he was also dealing with these big questions of what we actually are. He wrote them all up in a book called Incomplete Nature, The Emergence of Mind from Matter. Because the book is a hard read, technically difficult, even for academics, I wrote simplified version of it, faithful in that I worked closely with him to ensure I didn't distort it. I called Neither Ghost Nor Machine, The Emergence and Nature of Selves. These are not my ideas. These are ideas that I contributed to translate, but they're really Terry Deacon's ideas. They visited his Harvard lab where he was doing early stem cell research on neurons. I asked him if I had permission to use this work, and he said his ideas have a life of their own. He's not very proprietary about them and will talk to anyone who's curious. That's how I got involved. That's why I feel between that and the amount of rigorous collaboration we've done over the last 30 years, I feel justified in offering these intuitive, accessible explanations for them, trying to make it as resonant and real for you as I can. Why? I'll give you a personal reason. I've begun to give it before, but I'll also give you a social, civil reason for why I do this work. A personal one, it's great to have a project, and this is a very fun project. When I think about it, I should have realized it early on when I was trying to figure out what to do with myself, that trying to figure out what I actually am would be fruitful a game as any. We're all kind of self-obsessed and trying to figure out what to do. But to step back and wonder what selves really are, that's not a bad game. As I said in the last episode, this is also my non-spiritual path. I don't believe in transcendence. I'm not going to employ any abstractions or poetry about another realm to help explain me. It's non-spiritual, but it's extremely spirited, and it is my path. This is not just abstract stuff. I work among a bunch of academics who try to talk about it as neutrally as possible so as to not contaminate the academic or intellectual operating room with their own selfhood. I take the opposite tact. I'm actually trying to figure out what I am, and I'm using myself as an example in all of this work. That's one of the ways in which I can make it as intuitive as possible. But here's the social or political reason why I think this is useful stuff to get into. I think we have about used up the Earth's carrying capacity for our fictional narratives, these romantic stories we tell about what we are. I don't think we can wean ourselves off of those romantic stories. When I get to finally explaining what distinguishes humans, the symbolic capacity, if you've listened to anything I've said before, we're an incredibly anxious species. We need these reassuring narratives. I do not see us weaning ourselves off our need for reassurance, mojo boosts, and confidence building. We need that stuff, but the Earth can't take much more of it. When you think about how much fossil fuel we've burned through in tribal holy wars over who's the superior beings, whose version of the transcendent self is better, whose name-droppable imaginary friend God is better, and where we are right now, it's like we actually have to figure out what we are, because the one rule in all of evolution is adapt to reality or die. No other organism can do the kind of self-flattery that humans can do. That's a language thing. A dog might be cheerful, a dog might have more or less confidence depending on whether it pooped on the rug recently and you're shaming it. But a dog cannot play God the way that a human can. That's a language thing. And we've been playing God a long time, and we're not going to make it as a civilization if we don't figure out a different way to play God. So I am totally fine with romance, dreams of happily ever after. I don't see escaping those. In fact, I see efforts to escape them as a dream of happily ever after, that I'll transcend my ego and become enlightened. No, that's just the same game over again. But what I'm saying is it would really help if we got clearer on what we actually are, that we are neither ghost nor machine. I'm not something supernatural added to life. I'm actually a constraint, a limitation. I'm not something supernatural added to physics. I'm actually a constraint or limitation on physics that maintains the constraint. That's what I think I am. I'm a constraint that channels energy and matter into work to prevent the degeneration of the constraint. I'll explain how all that goes out. This is an incredibly long walk, but that's what I think I am. I have to explain that, and I cannot resort to ghosts or machines. What do I mean by ghost? I mean some supernatural force like life force, or even some scientific term like information. I can't simply say I'm information added to matter, like information in an information-bearing molecule like DNA. I can't say that because that's dualistic, borrowing from some imaginary realm. It's not really that different from saying, God poured his spirit into me. So I can't do that, and nor can I say that I'm just mechanics, that I'm just physical chemistry, just like that cup of coffee or the donut. No, I actually have to explain how physical chemistry, nothing but physical chemistry, could ever become a self like you and me. This was an interesting challenge for me working with Terry all these years. I was in the social sciences, and Terry was in the life sciences and was trying to get to the very bottom of it. We got to walk before we run. We got to crawl before we walk. We got to understand what selves and effort really are before we get to things like human consciousness or political dynamics. For a long time in our relationship, he was wary of how fast I wanted to leap to implications about human nature. Over time, we've gotten to where we talk about that stuff a lot. But most of our work together has been on the simplest possible self and the simplest possible trying. I promise that even though this is a long walk, in the next one I'll finally get to an explanation for the core self, the thing that has been sustained for 3.6 billion years, life. It's a limitation on physics that we have maintained for 3.6 billion years in our fragile bodies made of organic matter. Plants aren't made of meat. But how matter has limited itself, maintained its form continuously for that time, despite the fact that we are made of fragile stuff. We're made through fragile stuff. I have to explain it, and I'm going to give you the model for how that actually could have come about. A first step towards figuring out what you are, what we are, before it's too late. Thanks for listening. I know this is a lot.